So this morning you are at the media panel, How Race is Portrayed in the Media. And we are joined today by our illustrious panel, Vanessa De Luca, who is editor-in-chief of Essence Magazine. She's responsible for overseeing the content and vision for the preeminent magazine for Black women, or as I call it, the Black Women's Bible. We're also joined by Jamila Lemieux she's a senior editor from Ebony. She's a writer, speaker, and senior digital editor for Ebony Magazine, a Chicago native and a graduate of Howard University. Lemieux is a leading millennial voice on the issues of race, gender, and sexuality. Jamila Lemieux. We're also joined by Joy Reid. She's a national correspondent on MSNBC. Previously, she was the host of MSNBC's The Reid Report, a daily program that offered her distinctive analysis and insight on daily news. Before that, she was the managing editor of thegrio.com, an online news and opinion platform devoted to delivering stories and perspectives that reflect and affect African American audiences. Welcome, Joy Reid. And finally, last but not least, we are joined by Ken Sunshine. Right now, he's the only man on the panel, and we thank him for his presence today. Ken Sunshine founded Ken Sunshine Consultants, later to become Sunshine Sachs in 1991. And over the past 3 decades, the firm has acquired clients ranging from the Fortune 500 corporations, labor unions, and the political figures to some of the biggest household names in entertainment, music, and sports industry. So please welcome Ken Sunshine. So we're going to jump right in, and I want to ask the question specifically, and okay, I'm going to get rid of this. You all know who I am, so we don't necessarily need this. Many of you, 3 of you, are working in what is put out as media. Ken, we'll get to you in a second as someone who represents it from the other end. But specifically to the 3 ladies on the panel, I want to know how you think race is covered. Is there a difference between the stories about blacks in the media and the stories about whites in the media? And what is that difference that you've seen? And I want to start with Jamila.
Thank you for your question. There's a very big difference in how black people and white people, if we speak only to those 2 racial groups, are covered in the media, obviously. I think the biggest difference is control. So much of what you see of black and white people in the media is controlled by white people. It is seen through the lens of whiteness. So even when you have black reporters, black journalists, black writers that work for publications that are owned by non-black people and controlled by non-black interests, there's a lens there that isn't necessarily our own. That's not to discount the value of the very meaningful work that comes from black writers, black journalists, black publications that are not owned by black people. The problem for us is that I think we're still struggling to see a real honesty around the way that black people are portrayed in the media. I think it's getting better. I think if we look at what Joy and Tremaine Lee have been able to do at MSNBC for years now, particularly since the Trayvon Martin murder, if we look at what Wesley Lowery is doing at the Washington Post, and it's really feeling like America's newspaper at this point, if you look at what independently owned media, such as Ebony, such as For Harriet or Clutch, and some of these smaller, younger publications are able to do, we're shaping that. We're shaping the view of blackness for Americans through our own eyes, and we're able to tell our own stories and to tell them in a significant way. That doesn't mean that you won't have a reporter ask this very morning, what if Walter Scott had done the right thing?
Oh. Right.
I won't say the network, but that was a question that was posed on national news just this morning. Right. What if he had done the right thing? And this is the rare story in which it seems that the court of public opinion, not just black folks, agree that this person should not have been killed. That he should not have been pursued, he should not have been chased, he should not have been shot, and he should not have been killed. But still, that it's comfortable, it's okay, it's acceptable to say, but I mean, did he have to run? So I think that we have a long way to go, but we've certainly come a long way.
Okay. Anyone else want to answer? That was a great response.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here. It is great to be here. I actually did just get off a flight so if I sound a little hoarse, it's blame it on the plane. 'Cause I just got off the plane, so the air on the plane, I'm tired. Well, I think that I agree with what Jamila said, in that we have a situation where those of us who are, African American, who are Black, who are working in the media, not only do we have to deal with the unconscious biases that we know are inherent in the stories that we're telling, but just to be honest, there's unconscious biases even inside the media where we work. So that if we're telling a story like the one that we're doing now in South Carolina, we have to keep reiterating the fact that the victim does not have to have been a saint, did not have to have been an ideal human being, did not have to have no flaws in order to be a genuine victim. There's a constant sort of interrogation of the dead in these cases. So if you look at the progression all the way from Trayvon to now, everyone agreed that it was outrageous for a teenager to be pursued by somebody who was not in authority and killed, until people started saying, well, Trayvon Martin, he really wasn't such a good kid. Well, Trayvon Martin, let's start looking at his texts, let's start looking at his parents, and there's always this interrogation of the victim. And if the victim isn't absolutely perfect, then we lose the consensus really quickly. And I think we lose it internally in the media, and then that follows losing it externally in the world that's watching what's happening. So by the time you get to a Michael Brown, it didn't take much to turn that from a case that was shocking in that it was about the death of a teenager into a case where a lot of people, and not just people on the far right, were saying, well, this is a case about a thug who brought about his own death, and where the narrative of the officers automatically believed. And where it's the reflex to just believe that the police officer must have been telling the truth. And that now we interrogate the witnesses, the hands up narrative. Well, we now don't believe those 16 witnesses. And it just goes on sort of like that. And so I think that's sort of the frustrating thing, that you have to constantly reiterate, even within your own workplace, that the victims and the way that they were treated in and of itself is the story. It's not the victim's sort of blamelessness or lack of blamelessness in their own life. Right. And that can be a daunting, constant task, but it's something that I'm glad that at least there are some of us internally inside these organizations to be able to do it.
Absolutely. Vanessa, did you want to add into that?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Joy that, when we are in these organizations, that it is challenging sometimes to push through these stories. And I'd give as a huge example our Black Lives Matter cover on the February issue. We knew that was a story that we had to tell. And I have to be quite honest with you, I didn't know that I would get the support to do that cover, because we've never had a cover that didn't have a person on it. We've never had a cover like that in our 45-year history. Wow. But collectively, as editors and writers and keepers of our legacy, we felt that we could not let this moment pass without having that cover. Fast forward like a couple months later, what's on the cover of Time magazine? Mm-hmm. Black Lives Matter. Mm-hmm. And the editor of that magazine called me just to give me a heads up that they were doing this cover, because she was concerned that we would be concerned that they basically did the same thing that we did. Right. So I say all that to say that you can be influential. You can't be afraid to step out and and do what you believe is right and cover what you believe is right, because consequently it has like a domino effect. It gives other people the impetus to do what is right.
So Ken, I actually want to turn to you and ask, as someone who both advises clients and helps put out different stories and pitch different stories, how do you ensure that the stories that your clients want to tell is not impacted by race? Is there a way that you can do that you can sort of pitch it so that it is telling the narrative that your clients want to tell, but is not impacted by the biases that exist?
Well, it's more than a complicated question. Let me just start by saying it's all changed. The new world of the media, with print less important, with digital media dominating, has changed the rules. I mean, the truth is, people like me had much more power when there were real deadlines. There were editors you could talk to when newsprint dominated, an actual physical paper dominated the way news was covered, and largely television and other forms of media played off of print. That's obviously all changed, and the wild world of digital media has made it sometimes impossible to have any degree of control. But more specifically to your question, Janae, I think part of it is trying to appeal to journalists that are still journalists, that still have some standards, the editors that care about the truth. I mean, despite the horrific nature of some of the coverage of race and other important issues, there are still some great journalists out there. And I agree, I mean, things are not nearly what they should be, but they're better. And I'm the eternal optimist. I've been doing this kind of stuff for a long time and advising people like my friend Reverend Sharpton, you have to be the optimist. Let me segue to a real-life example of today. In New York, we have two tabloids. It's rare in this country. And one of them, the Daily News, is supposedly the better one, and the Post are the bad guys. But, the truth today, I mean, I brought show and tell. There's a front page story in the New York Daily News, back off Al. We don't want a circus. South Carolina cops shoot family to Rev. Stay away. This is the Daily News. These are the good guys. It's complete bullshit. I mean, it's completely made up. Now, usually they twist the truth, they play off of something. This is complete garbage. And this is today on an issue that virtually everybody, including my friends at the New York Post, agree is a horrific thing. I mean, there's nobody that can say what happened in South Carolina isn't an outrage. The video, as usual, makes it pretty hard to even question how horrific this is. But the Daily News makes it about Sharpton, who has nothing to do with it, and also caricatures him and uses race in a pretty vicious way. Now, the story of Al Sharpton and the press is, look where he is now, and look what the press does to him, even today, on an issue that nobody disagrees with. So the last laugh is on them, and he and this organization couldn't be more powerful. But I have to also point out the good old New York Post, whose story on South Carolina is very mild today. Nothing sensationalized, nothing about Sharpton, who, in fairness, had nothing to do with this. They have an editorial today, though. They can't help themselves. The editorial, if you can understand it, which is pretty hard, talks about, well, because there are so many cell phones around now, there aren't so many bad incidents because they'll be caught on video. Even and I'm pretty cynical after doing this for so long, it's kind of amazingly brilliant, twisted logic that things are better because everybody has cell phones because you'd get anybody that did anything bad. That's the world we're living in, ladies and gentlemen, and you just have to keep organizing and chipping away and in supporting organizations like this one, which frankly keeps telling the truth about some pretty horrific circumstances.
I want to ask another question. I know a lot of times people will talk about the role of media in shaping public views. And they place a lot of the responsibility on saying, well, the media gives us these images. But I want to ask about the real relationship, because obviously in the media are people. And those people have perceptions and biases. And, there's hardline news, which is factual reporting. And then you have more opinionated, editorialized sort of pieces. Specifically, though, to the hardline news, do any of you feel that there is this bias that still exists, even as you're reporting just the facts, that sort of creates that narrative around race specifically?
Well, I think the way that I'll answer that is, I think, we know that all human beings have these biases and that, it creeps into everything we do. But putting that aside, just looking at the hardline news, there are these two concepts called fairness and balance, right? And I think one of them is useful and the other is not. Fairness is important. Balance is BS in a lot of ways. Because balance means saying, some people say global warming is real. Some people say it's not. But it's 99% of people who say it's real and 1% that say it's not. pretending those two things are equal is balance.
Right.
But it isn't fair. Right? So what we wind up with and what we struggle against constantly in our business is that there is I'm trying to be politics, I still work in the media, but there is this desire, this quest for balance, and always trying to balance both sides equally. So if you have the case of a police shooting, trying to have exact balance between the police narrative and the person's narrative. But in this case, if it in fact turns out the police officer dropped a planted weapon and lied about his narrative, then there really isn't any way to balance the stories. It really is one side is right and one side is wrong. But I think there's a real reluctance, for some good reasons. There are people who will, there's lawsuits that happen. There's some amount of fear of lawsuits. There's some amount of fear of being wrong. So I think the media is so cautious, the mainstream media, that it's always trying to be exactly balanced. So for instance, if you look at a story like Walter Scott, the question is, when you're showing Walter Scott's photo, do you show a family photo of Walter Scott? Do you show a photo where Walter Scott looks sort of scowling? Do you show the photo of Walter Scott in his military uniform? Right. Because all those things are going to convey something very different. Mm-hmm. You're saying this guy ran from the police. If you show the sort of scowly picture, that's going to convey an unspoken message about him. Mm-hmm. If you show his military picture, that conveys a completely different message about him. To the wider audience that's looking at it, one of those two people seems more sympathetic. We got into this with the Trayvon Martin case. Right. Because Trayvon Martin is a baby-faced boy. But if you show the picture of him, the black and white photo with the hoodie, then you start to have internally people saying, well, that's not balanced because now you're making him look sympathetic. You have to show a neutral picture of him. Well, what's a neutral picture look like? Right. There were people who questioned the Hollister picture. They questioned all of these different photos. We wound up using a picture of him riding a horse because, he had gone on a horse ride. And then that got questioned. Well, you're trying to make him look young and innocent. Well, that picture happened to have been taken about a month before he died. Right. And yeah, he looked like 12 because he just had a baby face. Right. But we are showing an accurate depiction. And we're also showing the way the family wants their child who's gone to be seen. But then you get challenged, well, that's not balanced. You're now making him look too sympathetic. Or even calling him Trayvon in narrative instead of Martin. So you have this constant sort of quest for balance to make it very clinical and to take the emotion out of the stories, because there is, I think, on the part of news organizations, a desire not to look like you're taking sides. And I think it's challenging. That's the biggest challenge, I think, for journalists, is when a story is so full of emotional content, like a Walter Scott story, like a Michael Brown story, that sort of internal pressure to not put the emotion in and to make it clinical and make both sides seem equal.
Right. Vanessa, it looks like you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think I agree that balance is a fallacy, right? I mean, and I think it even comes out in the questions that are asked. Right. You go on a show thinking, okay, you're asked to, weigh in on Trayvon Martin or weigh in on they took Rihanna's song, took her away from the Super Bowl, or, and you think, well, I'm just going to give my, opinion how I feel, but the way that the questions are slanted, it's like they're looking for a very specific answer. Like they've already made a choice about what that means or what that issue is. And then you have to kind of navigate that and kind of, retain your sense of this is what it actually is. And then even in the follow-up questions, they're still trying to get you to say that thing that they want to hear. And so when I really don't think that it's even possible to watch anything anymore and feel that it's balanced, because I think, honestly, it feels like the fix is already in. And it's, if I'm being asked to weigh in on something, then I have to figure out, well, how do I get the point across that I want to make and get around all of these very clearly biased, many times, questions.
Begs the question then, how do people get news that is really factual, not slanted, not, sort of geared towards one person's perspective or the editor's, perspective, or this is what the editor says we're going to put out? Where do people go to get that sort of information?
I mean, it's like I grew up at the kitchen table with my parents reading everything. They read the newspaper, they read magazines, they read they read everything. They watched every news show, and we talked about what was on TV and what was in the news. We talked about it, and they would ask your opinion, like, well, what do you think? I mean, you should have an opinion about this.
Right.
And I learned that you don't just take one opinion, word for it. You don't just take that one newspaper or that, or that one magazine. You have to use your brain.
Right.
Right.
And figure out how you feel about something. And I think that we still have to do that now more so than ever.
Right.
Because we're really being force-fed a lot of information that is very, there's a very specific agenda
Right.
behind it. So you really we have to learn how to have an opinion and feel and think for ourselves. Again.
I think that's very true. Very true. So Joy brought up a good point, and that was about the photos. And I know there was, those of you who are on social media may have seen the campaign, which photo would they use, where ordinary people were putting up pictures of themselves, sort of, the nice, I guess, photo, or the, respectable, if you will, photo. And then maybe the photo of them having fun with friends, maybe out drinking, maybe, just doing what people do in their ordinary everyday lives, and whether that's going out in a Halloween costume as a certain character and that depiction, or again having fun with friends. And so I wanted to ask Jamila, how do you think we as individuals can help shape the narrative? Joy talked about the fact that these editors are selecting these pictures. And they're trying to select the one that's going to cause the least amount of controversy. But yet it seems like, specifically when it is a Black individual, they are shown in this somewhat negative seeming light. So you had the first picture of Mike Brown that came out. That was just him sort of standing there. And then you got a picture of him throwing up a peace sign, which they then interpreted as a gang sign. So how do we take back control of that part of the narrative? Specifically, is there any way that we as the general public can help sort of make sure that people know that this image that you're seeing is not necessarily the image that this person was?
I think that, well, one, it's important to remember that the fallacy of balance is something that impacts us more than it does other people. A police officer kills someone, there's not a lot of hand-wringing over which picture of him to use. It's a picture of him smiling for his officer portrait in his uniform, and he has on his hat and his stripes, and he looks like what he's supposed to be, a respectable member of the community who's charged with serving and protecting, right? When it comes to us, there is are we going to present him as a bad kid? Is he a good kid? If he's smiling, are we suggesting that he's good? Is he really good? Is our job to say he was good or bad? We're more comfortable telling you that he was bad than we are suggesting that he may have been good. In terms of taking back power, it's a power that we've never had, so I don't think we can reclaim it. I think that we can make steps toward claiming it by raising our voices, by saying, that campaign, and I think the hashtag was "If They Gun Me Down." Mm-hmm. It was directly in response to the tradition of using scowling pictures of Black men once they've been killed by police officers, or using mugshots of Black female victims of crime. The two young women who were killed in Florida, and there was barely a blip in the media, Angelia Ball and, I don't want to pronounce her name incorrectly, but starts with a T, Tasia, I think, Magnum, they were reported as being exotic dancers, which was not necessarily true. And they were found hog-tied, naked, and murdered on the side of the road. The first local news stories about these two women used their mugshots. We know there's no question about whether they were victims or not. Regardless of what they had done 5 minutes prior to being murdered, they were murder victims. You don't accidentally get hog-tied and found bound and naked on the side of the road. But they chose to use mugshots of these women. When that happens, we have to speak up. You have to write to the editor. You have to tweet to the newspaper or the television network's account and say, this is unfair. This is inappropriate. And if you continue to portray people in this way, we will not support you.
Can I add one thing to that? And I think that the Walter Scott case is a perfect example of the public having to stand up and demand that our profession interrogate some of these narratives, right? So when there's a police shooting that happens, the police put out a statement saying what the officer's side of it is, and you're required to put that in. But I don't think it's wrong to interrogate that a little bit, because pretty much, if you talk to any attorney, they'll tell you that it is standard procedure for an officer when a shooting happens to say a certain number of things. He tried to take my weapon. I thought he had a gun. I was in fear for my life. Right? So Patrick
Absolutely.
Dorisman. I thought he had a weapon. He went for my gun. I was in fear for my life. You can go through any of these cases and go back and read the police. I don't have to make the litany. You know that it's very standard procedure.
Right.
So for the first 4 days, when I spoke to the family of Walter Scott, what they were upset about as well, if the video hadn't come out, the way that story would have been written was, the officer said that
Right.
Mr. Scott lunged for his taser, attempted to take his weapon, and that the officer was in fear for his life. Mr. Scott was killed at the scene, and it would have been that's the way that
Right.
story, and that's it.
And it would have ended.
And the family would have been jumping up and down screaming, our family member would never fight a cop and try to
Right.
take his weapon. And by the way, what is this epidemic of black men irresistibly trying to take officers' guns?
Right.
It seems like they can't resist.
Right, right.
Like they keep trying to do it. It's like, for what, like 150 years, black men are
Right.
still trying to take, what is
Absolutely.
this about this obsession with trying to take, but that aside, that's my own editorial comment, but we have to interrogate that narrative. When we get the 20th story that says the same thing, we should, I think, as journalists, it's not being biased to say, does that make sense, police chief, police spokesman? Does it make sense that this person tried to take the officer's weapon? We should interrogate it a little more. We shouldn't just print the stories because an official told us that.
Right.
Because at the end of the day, the police are the government, and the government is responsive and responsible to the public. The taxpayer pays for our government, and the police are just the armed wing of our government. So we have a right to interrogate everything they say. They are our essentially employees.
Right.
But we've given, I think that one of the bigger narratives that African Americans, but all Americans really need to stand up and say is, are we claiming enough power over our own institutions? Do we exercise enough power over our government, or do we allow our government to exercise full and complete lethal power over us without standing up and questioning it?
Absolutely. Yes, sure can.
I think the context of that is, I think, if there's any good news in any of this, it's wearing very thin. It's playing on stereotypes. It's playing on, the savage nature of African American males. And in the midst of, crime, if you look at the statistics, there are, many more horrific crimes committed by white people. It just doesn't play as well. The perception is it doesn't play as well, and thus the stereotyping that really is a throwback to another era. I said it before, I remain eternally optimistic about young people. There are certain things that just don't play with young people as much as this kind of stereotyping. I think people were at that dinner last night. It was one of the most moving things I've ever been part of, but I thought it was just terrific. But the subject of dealing with homosexuality, dealing with the issue in all communities, came out in a very dramatic way, I think, last night. That issue has really changed among young Americans. I'm not sure on race, frankly, young white Americans are as enlightened as I would like to think, but I think marginally a little better. But there's certain issues that young people are doing better on. I don't think this stereotyping on crime, particularly when it involves an African American male, plays nearly as well as it does. And frankly, circulation of tabloid newspapers keeps going down. So maybe there's a message there somewhere. But I think in answer directly to your question, what has to be done, people should protest these things. They should be marching. The Daily News should be castigated and shockingly embarrassed by pulling this crap at Reverend Sharpton today. But by the way, guys, that's not going to work. He's more powerful than ever. This organization is, look what's going on this week. It's extraordinary. So the bad guys aren't winning anymore. And remember, this is the more enlightened tabloid.
Know that there are cases that are happening just as frequently of black women who are being killed. And these stories not only are not in the media, we're not seeing them gain traction on social media. So how is it that the media decides what story is the fascinating story that they want to tell nationally, versus, what's the story that they're just going to push to the side and let it stay local?
I mean, I don't think that there's as much thought that goes into it as you might think, to be honest with you, I admit. I think sometimes the stories are being picked up in a lot of cases because of the public, because it's on social media. Nowadays, if something is bubbling up on social media, what people are talking about becomes the news. In a lot of cases, these killings, these shootings start as local news stories. So some of the local stations are more proactive about trying to nationalize their own story, about promoting it on their own social media so to get picked up, or the national network that's affiliated with them will pick it up. Sometimes it's just a story that's just odd, that's just off the beaten path, like something you don't hear all the time. And sometimes it's the families being smart about getting representation, quite honestly. The families who are proactive about trying to tell their loved one's story will get more traction. I can tell you there are a lot of cases, and this is one I think it's important for people whose loved ones are women. A lot of the times the families decide that, for very good and legitimate reasons, that they just don't want any part of any media, and they don't want anyone bothering them. And then they become very difficult to contact. So after you've tried to sort of reach out to them, if they don't talk to you, you can't do a story. Right. So sometimes, and it's a horrible thing to say, because in that moment, I would probably just have a nervous breakdown by myself. I wouldn't even be able to talk. I'm amazed at these mothers in a lot of cases, and fathers who are able to be so composed to talk on time. It's incredible to me, because I don't know how they do it. But unfortunately, the way it works, it's such a grind, especially in the cable world where it's 24 hours, that it's about the stories that are accessible, that have a character that's compelling, that have something that's unique about them, and where you can talk to someone.
I want to ask Jamila to follow up on that question. Don't let my talking, please continue with the applause. I'm sorry. I keep talking over your applause. I want to allow the panelists to get their due credit. But Jamila, I want to figure out, is there something that we should be doing on social media? How can we elevate the stories of Black women? Because I do feel like, and I don't know whether it is, something that people are cognizant of. How can we create a campaign that's focused on some of these issues facing Black women? I know you have a huge digital following, and you do a lot digitally. How do we get these stories out? Because I feel like there is this silencing of Black women that just doesn't exist. And the narrative then becomes Black men are at risk, when the reality is Black women are just as at risk.
I think, this is something I've really struggled with. Why are we not able to get traction around the, unjust incarceration, the murder, the abuse of Black women and girls in the way that we're able to compel broad international outrage around the killing of Black men and Black boys? And it's not to say that there isn't any outrage and that, various news organizations and individuals are raising those stories. I think such as The Final Call, which has a cover story on the state of women and girls. The cases of Trayvon Martin and Renisha McBride are both powerful examples of how social media led to outcomes that were not going to happen. So the people who, it was more likely that Timothy Wafer was going to be charged and arrested with Renisha McBride's killing, I think, than George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin. But in both cases, there wasn't a lot of interest or attention around the deaths of these young people. It didn't seem that the local district attorneys wanted to arrest their killers, but there was a lot of noise made on social media. In Detroit, Dream Hampton, who's a veteran journalist, got people, she said, you know what, I have a big Twitter following. I'm going to get people to go down to the police station. We're taking this to the streets. This is not okay. This woman knocked on a homeowner's door for help after a car accident, and his immediate reaction was to kill her and to repeatedly refer to her as an it in his interviews and on the stand. However, there are not nearly as many people who can name Renisha McBride as who can name Trayvon Martin or Mike Brown or Tamir Rice. There was a successful prosecution of her killer, but I don't think that makes what happens to her any less infuriating or threatening to us. The idea that even a woman, even a young woman, can't knock on a neighbor's door and say, I need help. You don't have to open the door, just call the police. It's important that we continue to hashtag names and talk about these things on social media and to challenge Essence and Ebony when we fall short right, in terms of raising these women and girls' names and voices, and also to support us when we are making a deliberate and concerted effort in bringing attention to these issues. And I think it's important to acknowledge Kimberly Crenshaw and the African American Policy Forum, who've done such fantastic work around the condition of Black women and girls. From doing something very difficult and publicly challenging My Brother's Keeper, not merely on its merits, but the idea that Black men and boys are in need of a dedicated White House initiative, something completely unprecedented, something we've never seen before from any administration. But that Black women and girls somehow are just okay, or that we're going to benefit from some sort of trickle-down success. If the boys and men are doing better, somehow you'll be doing better too. When all of the research and all the facts say that we are certainly in need as well. And I think it's something that we as a community, as individuals, as activist groups, as journalists, we have to face that for ourselves. And I think that many of us, including myself at times, don't necessarily realize when we are skewing toward the men and the boys, because the men and the boys will stand up for the men and the boys. The women and girls will stand up for the men and the boys. But when it comes to us, oftentimes we're alone. And I sometimes wonder, and then when we look to women of other races, we don't necessarily get the support as women, as sisters, that we may need or deserve. And so we're kind of out here by ourselves. And it's also worth noting that Black women and girls are more likely than any to be killed or murdered by anyone. We're most likely to be killed or murdered by someone who looks like us, by a Black man. And those stories are important too, so we can't just be outraged when somebody outside. I don't do the Black on Black crime thing. That's a phrase that I do not organically say. It's a farce.
Absolutely.
But it's important to talk about the ways in which Black women and girls are targeted within our community because of our gender. And I think that being forced to recognize that allows us to be in a better place to recognize the ways in which we let our sisters down consistently.
Sure.
The only other thing I wanted to add to that is, as the Black Women's Bible, as you describe it, in essence, we see it as our responsibility for these stories not to be invisible, right? But it's also important to us to cover the stories long after the other cameras have gone away.
Right.
So, for example, the many examples of brutality of women by police. We went back last year and covered followed up on 3 women's stories just to find out what happened. Did they win their cases? Which they did. Some of them did. Did they get restitution? Some of them did. That's important as well, not to just kind of leave it in that moment, but to also go back and follow up. And the other thing I wanted to say is that when we do something where we're collecting groups of voices, like we did with our Black Lives Matter issue, we were very clear that we needed to make sure that women's voices were a part of that package, that it wasn't just the voices of men. And so there were a great deal of Michelle Alexander, Sherelle Brown, Isabel Wilkerson, Goldie Taylor, Sunny Hostin, incredibly powerful women speaking out with all very different points of view. That's just as important as just making sure that, that the stories are told, but making sure that the voices are inclusive.
No, that definitely is important. It definitely is important. I think sometimes, the stories start out and they have a lot of traction and then they do die off and people often wonder, well, what did happen to that story? No one ever knows the outcome. People forget and don't realize that the story is still continuing, and especially for the victims' families. The story never ends. And so that is an important part of continuing that. The next question that I wanted to ask, actually, so we're joined now by Reverend Sharpton. And at this time, I will give him the mic. Thank you.
Let me say this. You have a case in point of media. Ken Sunshine said he already talked to you about this story. One of the reasons that I'm late is the brother of the deceased, Walter Scott. Brother Anthony Scott just talked with Associated Press and I and said that not only did the family never say that, the only reason I'm not at the funeral tomorrow is that we have our convention. and they have arranged. I'm preaching at their church Sunday morning with them, and we're going to have a prayer vigil that even the mayor and police chief is coming at the site where his brother was killed. So we're gonna make this front page blow up in their face. And but it shows that first of all, if you read the story, the lawyer says in the story, but just anything to a front page. I mean, me going or not going to a funeral really ain't front page news. I know. Joyce say I'm important, but I really ain't that. I mean,
You are important. No, you're important.
What is front page about that? What about the new dash cam coming out?
Right.
What about, who else was in the car? But you gonna make a front page on whether I go to the funeral or not? It goes to show you that they are more concerned about movements that will fight for justice than they are about getting justice. And I think that is why what y'all do all over the country is important. But it is also why, and I tell a lot of our young leaders of chapters and young activists, that is also why you ought to know what you're signing up for. This is not a joyride. You go after them, they will go after you. We had 1,200 people at the dinner last night, Cass Empire, Anthony Anderson, all that, and I got to wake up to this kind of front page. Not thousands came out last night, but back off Al to people that I wasn't going to. I mean, the whole world knows that we're in convention. How would I have gone to a funeral in South Carolina and be here tomorrow? I mean, but that's what you had to be prepared for if you're going to be an activist. So know what you're saying. Know what you say. I told a brother that came in to Nan and said, I just want to be the next Al Sharpton. I said, you can be the Al Sharpton now. Here's the key. Let me tell you what rent we pay in 10 cities. You're going to need about $500,000 just for the rent every year. Because we don't know this is not a joyride. And when Tavis and I are not great friends, but Tavis' book was right. The depression Martin Luther King was under the last year of his life, he was being attacked by the left, saying he was a sellout, attacked by the right as a communist. I mean, you have no idea. And when part of my burden, I'm used to it, is when I look at a front page like this, that my daughters have to live through that. People forget, you got family. My kids got to hear all of this stuff about their daddy. And you got to put all that on the line. You will only do this if you believe in it, which is the only reason you would do it. But at the same time, that is also the reason why media becomes important. Because if you don't have the balance of an Essence or an Ebony or what Joy Reid does, you won't get your own community to get this stuff out. Now, Joy may go back and get it on MS that the family's saying so-and-so, and I know Ebony and Essence do it. But even with the correction, mainstream media was going to try to find a way. I remember yesterday, Reverend Jackson was here yesterday talking about I came under him like he did Dr. King. I remember that Reverend Jackson, I believe 83, 84, went to, Ken may know because he helped both of us, and he went and got a hostage out of Syria. And this guy has a Navy pilot, had been shot down and held by Assad's daddy, the Assad that we talk about now. Jesse went in, negotiated his release, got him and put him on the plane, brought him back when he landed. First question the media asks is, who paid for your plane ticket? That's the first question. Who paid for your plane ticket? Who underwrote that? He said, I brought a hostage out of bond. Yeah, but who paid for it? We want to know what happened with push funds. So it's always going to, if you're looking for those on the other side to applaud you, forget about that. And that is all right with me. But when I look at, in this convention, Michael Brown's parents are here. And the Gardners are here. And the family of Trayvon Martin is here, and Sean Bell's family. And that's why I called them all on the stage last night, because that's what we're here for. If I'm all right with Miss Gardner, I don't ever have to be all right with the Daily News. If I'm all right with Trayvon's mother, I could care less what New York Times said. Because they are not who you fighting for anyway. And I think that that is where we've got to do that, and they will play these divide and conquer games. So, Janae, you was getting ready to ask the second question. I just was giving a news scoop. Come on. Joy just flew in from South Carolina. In fact, she was on Politics Nation last night. Give her a hand.
So the question that I was going to ask was, Jamila was talking about how we don't always protect ourselves, and there's a certain news personality who has notoriously been someone who makes comments that are just a little off center, and they are a person of color, a man of color, and so I want to talk about how that impacts what happens behind the scenes. So obviously what we see on TV is one thing. What all of us see on TV or what we read in newspapers is one thing. But how does someone who is a person of color, one of our own, who is out there saying things about our community that often hurt our community, how does that impact what happens in the back room, in the editorial meetings and that sort of thing? How does that play out? And I'll allow anyone to sort of jump in on that. I don't know if you can give up too much, if you can pull back the curtain too much, but.
Well, I can tell you that somebody like that would get booked on cable TV a lot, for sure. Yeah, I mean, well, and it depends. And I'm not, I won't go into the personalities of any, individual people, but the reality is that novelty, cable news loves novelty. So if you have a black conservative, that's a desirable booking for a certain, shows because it gives you this alternate view. I won't go into the politics of it. I think for that side, they want to have people of color voicing their views, and they really push them out front, and they're very aggressive about getting them booked on TV. I don't think it doesn't impact what I do, because, I think that Reverend Sharpton made a very good point. You have to know what you're doing for, and who you're doing it for. And if you know what your mission is and what you're trying to do, nothing that really anybody else says is commentary impacts, at least doesn't impact what I do.
Anyone else want to tackle it?
I'll say briefly, I can't speak to what that does in a newsroom because the people I work with are black.
Right.
And I don't work for a television news network, obviously. But what someone like that, not focusing so much on that person, but just people that are either deliberate provocateurs, so who are very happy to say, gotta hear both sides, or, I want to present the counter narrative to what the average African American may think. Whether those are their actual beliefs or they just really want to be on television, right? Or to go viral, to have a clip. I resent the out that gives people that were already looking for one. So if you're not convinced of the humanity of black people, you're not quite sure that Black lives matter, you absolutely know that police lives matter, when it comes to a police shooting of a black person, you're typically going to assume that it was justified, but perhaps you're willing to hear everybody out, but you kind of already know where you stand on that. And then you have 99 black people saying, this is unjust. Look at the evidence. Look at the history of policing in this country and black people. Look at the circumstances around this shooting. We don't feel that this was the right thing. And then there's one lone black voice saying, but what if he had done the right thing? Mm-hmm. What if he weren't such a thug? Did you know that he was arrested for stealing a candy bar in 1987? Can you really trust somebody who stole a candy bar in 1987? I can't. Therefore, I'm inclined to believe the officer. It's not just about that voice being amplified on cable TV, but the many, many members, our countrymen, rather, our fellow Americans, who are going to look to that person not just as an authority on blackness, but as the voice of reason in the room.
Yeah, that's a dangerous place to be. I think we're going to start to open it up for question and answer. Faith is going to come around. If you have a question for our panel, raise your hands, and Faith will come to you. We have one right here.
Hi there. Hi there. My name is Aaron Morrison. I'm a reporter with
Can you
the
stand up for
Sure.
us? Thank you.
I'm a reporter with the International Business Times, and I spent a few days in Ferguson, Missouri, and I talked to some people who felt like the media coverage was overwhelming and at a point became harmful to the story of Michael Brown and not helpful. So I'm wondering if you, anyone on the panel, can talk about who the winners and losers were of how Michael Brown's case was covered in the media.
Good question. Anyone want to tackle that?
Who the
one?
winners and losers were? I mean, I think in a very profound way, Michael Brown and Eric Garner forced the media to change the way that we cover the shootings of black men by police. And the reason I say that is there was a point in the coverage where parts of the media were attempting to spin the entire Ferguson story into one of out-of-control black people rioting. And the reason that I know that that narrative sunk in with some is that even when I was just in South Carolina during this press conference that the mayor and the police chief gave, one of the reporters, I couldn't see who it was, said, but it was not a person of color, or at least I don't think, said, "Are you surprised that this didn't become another Ferguson? Are you surprised that immediately after the shooting there weren't basically riots?" Like implying that the natural inclination of African American communities is just to go out and start burning the community down. So there was a certain sort of narrative that set in that I think was not helpful. And I don't think the media was as careful as we could have been in characterizing exactly what was happening on the streets of Ferguson, why there was unrest and what the unrest was caused by. But I think overall, the Michael Brown case was the first time you really did have a long-term, in-depth examination of a police shooting. And when that was amplified by Eric Garner, where there was just an unambiguous, where almost nobody believes that that shouldn't have resulted in some kind of a court case, I think for maybe the first time for a lot of people who tend to believe the police narrative, those two cases together forced people to start to interrogate that narrative. So I think overall, the Michael Brown case, I think Michael Brown's legacy is one of having really changed the way the media looks at police shootings. That's unfortunate because there have been a lot of cases where here Reverend Sharpton is here and he's been involved in so many of them, Amadou Diallo, Patrick Dorsman. You would think that the media gets it after, all these generations of these same stories, but they really, I think the media has a reflex to, as I said, believe the authorities. The Michael Brown case forced us to pay attention to this one death for almost a year, and I think that's important in and of itself.
I also think that the community won because was a big winner, because if there was something that was being misrepresented by the media, people went on Twitter,
Yeah.
Black Twitter went crazy
Absolutely.
to check it, to say this is not what's happening. We're on the ground. This is actually what is going on. So I would say that, and that's still continuing. So I would say that's a huge win because the voices of the people are what were really heard. It came through the strongest.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Ken?
Yeah, I think, I agree with both statements. I think the coverage was better than it has been in similarly horrible things over the years. I think a lot of us make a mistake. We're so almost obsessed with watching every nuance that we're watching cable TV like 20 hours a day. And you can make yourself insane. And then every so often they'll get some protester in Missouri who's saying really provocative, crazy things and looks like he's about to shoot the cameraman. And that can get played on another cable station, and that becomes a certain narrative. It doesn't affect the majority of Americans, though. There's a core group that watches this stuff incessantly, is tweeting all day, and they're more activists, and frankly, their minds, people like me or my crowd, our minds are made up, and we're going to try to use it to try to change the world, frankly. But the majority of Americans who were affected by this, I think it's been actually very positive in Michael Brown and Garner, because these are so outrageous, and of course, the current situation, so obvious that fair-minded people can't help but think that something is insane and there's no other side or another view, despite the attempts of some media outlets and certainly some reporters, editors, photo editors, to divert attention to the trivial, the sensational, that'll get away from the real issues at hand.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here to share with us. My name is Lakia Hill. I'm the Syracuse president, chapter president for NAN, effective April 25th. So I'm very excited about that. I have two questions. Thank you. I'm really excited. I have two questions. One first in dealing with holding media accountable. I think that is so important. And in advising us in ways that we can organize and campaign with holding our local media, because there's one with the national piece, right, where everybody sees what happens in the world. But within our own communities, especially in highly urban communities, how can we go about holding our local media accountable effectively? Like, what are some strategies? Just a few points. I know we don't have a lot of time, but maybe like 2 or 3 strategies that we could utilize and begin to work on there. And then the other one has a lot to do with image, especially with young Black girls, which is really important to me, and how the media depict us and what they see in these same communities. What are some ways that we can work with your publications in actually establishing womanhood and what it really looks like for our young girls? Because a lot of them really see themselves as, what is a woman? We asked the question with 100 Black men, some of my students, what is a woman? And the young lady's response, Jesus, was, she gave the full definition of a woman, like, what's in the dictionary. And she said, and we're also workers, we also clean, we cook, we raise our children, we have kids. Literally, this is a 5th grader, and this was her response. So what are some other ways that we can partner with you locally for the work that we do in those communities with young girls to be effective, to help them see their woman and what they can be outside of what they see in their environment? I know it's a lot.
Jamila wants to take a stab at one.
I'll try to briefly answer them both. To your second question, I think it's great that you have Essence and you have Ebony and you have all these wonderful online publications that are created by Black women and girls that you can point to that are highlighting the diversity of Black womanhood. So it's not just about challenging the media narrative or saying you're more than reality stars. We know that we're more than reality stars, but we're diverse, and I think in the attempts to reclaim Black womanhood, there's also a misguided attempt at times to sanitize it. So that you have to be holy, you have to be perfect, you have to be married, you have to be, any number of things to be good. And that it's good to be a Black woman, regardless of whether you're good on paper, and that we're different and diverse and multifaceted in many, many ways. As far as holding local media accountable, I think because social media has made everything local and you have access to people all across the country, if not the world, particularly through your organizational membership and leadership, you can say we're troubled by how the local XYZ affiliate in Syracuse has reported the shooting of a young Black man. And you can amplify that and you can share that issue with people who may have never been to, never heard of Syracuse, New York. There was a young reporter from the Post-Courier who interviewed the family or the neighbors and the family of the officer who killed Walter Scott. And she just kind of offhandedly tweeted, Michael Slager. Officer Slager had 2 dogs. I wonder who's taking care of them. And that's almost like SNL skit worthy in terms of like, how do you define white privilege? Being able to think about the dog, not the victim's dogs, but the killer's dog. How unfortunate. They'll be okay. They're dogs, right? And if they're not okay, they're not a father, a veteran who just lost his life for no reason publicly in front of the entire world on a video that you likely saw before you were able to find just even a moment to waste 140 characters on some dogs. She learned very swiftly that was a regrettable comment, and it wasn't necessarily about reaching out to her employer or demanding a boycott of her or this newspaper that's done some really important work in this case once the video came out. Not necessarily, no. We wouldn't necessarily say they were doing important work in this case before the video came out. When the video came out, they got on the right side of history real quick. But she heard from people. She heard from people who would have never heard of her before. I'm sure, whoever runs the social media account for the newspaper heard from people. And that's something that we can do over and over again. So when it's more profound, when the story about the dogs gets in the newspaper, that's when the hashtagging, comes on. That's when you send a tweet to Vanessa or to me or to Joy and say, hey, something happened. We need a signal boost here. And if it's something that we should be signal boosting, more likely than not, you'll get that.
Go ahead.
Yes, my name is Thomas Lopez Pierre. First, I love Black women, so my sister. My question, I have a couple of children, and my ex-wife and I have a couple of children, and and I can leave 3 or 4 blocks in Harlem and go buy a gun very inexpensively. So my question for the panel is, in terms of Mia, why is it that every time there's a school shooting, somebody goes crazy in the school and starts killing folk? It's always a white middle-class privileged person, and it's not so-called someone from a violent community. You never see black people killing their children in public schools, but the media is always so quick to jump on that black men are doing X, Y, Z. And I'm just wondering your thoughts on that.
Did
Y'all looking over here? Because we do this. Okay, so I mean, I think just if you talk to the FBI, statistically, spree killings and serial killings. I mean, there's no racial categorization of crime. Like every race commits crime. Black people, white people, all kill each other. There's no real necessarily difference. And as a matter of fact, intra-racial crime, like the same percentage of white people kill white people as black people kill black people. There really isn't a lot of difference. But there are certain crimes that do have tendencies, like Clint Van Zandt, who we have on a lot, who's a former FBI profiler, will tell you that when we were doing the story of the sniper, the DC sniper, he was on our air saying it was most likely a middle-aged, 30s to 40s white male with a military background, because there is a profile of serial killers and spree killers. I can't get into the sociology of why there are young white men committing these spree killings and serial killings. But all I can speak to on a media panel is that I think the media does need to challenge itself to make sure that when these crimes happen, whether it's a black perpetrator or a white perpetrator, that we are even-handed in the way that we're discussing them, right? That in the one case, we're not putting it down to mental health and saying, was his mom a good mother? And in the other case, just saying, oh, he's a thug. And not even digging any deeper into, did this person have mental illness? I think of the case of the really horrible shooting of those 2 police officers. A lot of our media did blow past the fact this was obviously a very mentally ill man. That was not in the front of the narrative, whereas in the case of the Aurora shooting, which took place in the mall near where I grew up, that went right to mental illness, right? But you're talking about, in both cases, somebody who slaughtered people. In both cases, but in one case we went right to mental illness, and by the way, he was apprehended alive. By the way, I should note, and he mowed down people in the theater. But okay, but anyway, I'm gonna go on past that. But he was brought in alive. Wasn't even tased. Right.
You are absolutely right.
But I think and that's our job in media, and that is why it's so important. One of the other winners, the gentleman here who asked the winners and losers, I think one of the other very briefly winners in the case of Michael Brown was the media itself, in the sense that suddenly a lot of voices that were not out there on a national level were given a national platform. Tremaine Lee is, I think, an example of that. Wesley Lauer is an example of that. Jamila Lemieux, and she knows I'm sort of her off-the-books publicist because I'm such a big fan of hers. But I mean, people who you weren't necessarily seeing booked on shows on CNN, on MSNBC, people who didn't necessarily have that platform. A lot of really great young journalists of color came out of that, who are still out there doing really great work.
So we don't have time for any more audience questions. I'm going to ask one final question and ask the panelists to offer your final thoughts as you're giving your closing statement. Ken, you started making a statement that now a lot of people have a voice, and there are things that we can do to sort of change the media. And so my question is, this is an activist audience. What is it that you would suggest we do to change how media is portrayed? I'm sorry, how race is portrayed in the media? And I'll start with you, Ken, and then we'll go to Jamila and we'll come to the other side, and then offer any final thoughts you might have.
Short answer, engage in very active social media campaigning. Social media affords tools that my generation never dreamed of having when we were trying to organize, to get on TV or to get a photo in the newspaper. Activate, there's virtually nobody that is not involved in some level of social media. And let me tell you something, media outlets don't like getting attacked. I don't care who they are or who's attacking them. They don't like being attacked, especially if what they did is shameful and cannot be defended. Secondly, George, look, I couldn't be more encouraged by the attendance and what's come out of this convention. Next year, there should be 4 times as many people. And organizations like this need to be supported on every level imaginable, and that has effect. That's the way you influence the media. Also, from a strictly PR point of view, learn to be smarter about how you present yourself to the media. There are obvious ways to get media attention that are not trivializing what you're doing, but will make it more likely that you'll get covered. And it's who you put out front, who's the spokesperson. There are a lot of people that the media gets attracted to because they can speak in sound bites, but they may not represent anything or anybody. Don't put them out front. And also, much of the media, not all, but some of it, they want new, younger, different voices, but they've got to know how to play the game and know how to be available at all times. They've got to be able to develop relationships with some of these media people, even if the media people are not fair or necessarily too smart. They are in those positions, and in the end, they're looking for stories. And as much as people like me can wail about how they trivialize, how they stereotype, how they sensationalize everything, the fact is they have to file stories all the time. And, if you only get 80% of what you wanted, that's pretty good. At least you're getting something. And don't be pessimistic. It's easy to complain about the media. Joe Hill, don't mourn, organize. That's my message.
Thanks, Ken. Jamila?
I'll certainly echo Ken's sentiments about being active on social media. That also requires that we aspire to higher levels of media literacy. So it's very important to understand the difference between the Washington Post and, say, if somebody were to set up a site called the New Washington Informer, right? And I just completely made that up. I don't believe that's the name of a real newspaper. But if I get the right template and I make it look like a newspaper, right? It looks like something you'd see on a real quote-unquote news site. Can you tell the difference between something that's a story that's coming from a real journalist or the Associated Press or somebody's blog? Now, that's not to say that the blogger can't be just as an astute, smart commentator, which is very different than being a journalist, or that they're, a savvy reporter that just doesn't work for a big publication. They're a citizen reporter. They're doing meaningful work. But who's vetting it? Right? Mm-hmm. Can you tell the difference between something that was created to make you feel a particular type of way about yourself, about people who look like you? Not a good way. That's presented to you as if it's factual news. Here's the truth about Michael Brown that you did not know. Here's some evidence that's come forward. I saw people who I consider to be media savvy, smart, college trained, sharing mind-numbingly ridiculous stories about Ferguson in August and September because they were on legitimate-looking websites. For no other reason other than it looked like, I saw a friend of mine who's from St. Louis who was just completely all over the media coverage, sharing one of these articles. I'm like, you think that who wrote some right-wing nut wrote this outside of Fox News where they won't let him in? And you're sharing this with your audience without any sort of commentary because you thought it was real. I think it's incredibly important that we're media literate, which means you can take the great stories from MSNBC and you can challenge the ones that you don't agree with, but know and understand and be able to digest and share what you're reading. And it's not necessarily about everyone having a blog. We're at the point now where the attention that you put into a blog that may only compel 15 readers may be better spent organizing a campaign to support an existing news organization, to compel people on social media, maybe keep your conversations there as opposed to writing 2,000-word missives that are really hard to get people to read. Or even contributing to a local newspaper, be it one that's published by your church, by your National Action Network chapter, or just a local community newspaper. And also, I'll end with a final plea. Black media needs your support now more than ever. These are difficult times. We're working very hard to serve you. Black media is a very broad term that includes a lot of different people, folks who work for Black magazines and folks who don't. I can speak specifically to what we're dealing with at Ebony Magazine and ebony.com. We're here for you. We want to serve you. We want to hear from you about the sort of stories that you want to read. And we also need and require your support so that we can make another 70 years, because we will be 70 this November. Thank you.
70 years. That's a great milestone. Okay, so I'm going to turn it to Vanessa and Joy for their final thoughts.
First of all, I just want to say amen, Jamila. Yes, we need support. I mean, that is so incredibly important. But I want to say, challenge us, challenge Black media. We have a tendency, especially those of us based in New York, to be very New York-centric, to not get out of our silo, and to not recognize that there are cajillion stories out there that we should be hearing about. So we need to hear from you in order to know what that is. We give our email and our Twitter and ways to contact us for a reason, because we want to hear from you. We truly do. I think that will only make us better. So please use that opportunity to communicate with us. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to be real brief. I'm going to give you 3 things that I think are very important for you to do in terms of shaping and reshaping the images of Black people in mainstream media, which is all I can really speak to. 'Cause I used to work for Black publication, The Griot. Keep supporting The Griot. They're amazing, and they're over at CNN now, so congratulations to them on that. So do support your Black media, please. All right, so here's my quick 3 for mainstream media. Number 1, push back. Ken Sunshine is absolutely right. The media hates getting pushed back. It freaks them out. If you complain, it absolutely freaks them out. They will listen to it, and they will take it under advisement. So push back. Number 2, don't do it by yourself. Jamila made the point. A one-off blog with 15 people may feel good for you to write that or write a Facebook post, but you need to do things collectively. The reason social media and hashtag campaigns are powerful is that they can gather collective support really, really quickly. And so if you suddenly have 1,000 and then 10,000 people tweeting to a hashtag, and then all of a sudden it hits 60 and 50,000, people literally in mainstream media will report on how many people are tweeting to a hashtag. That in and of itself will become a story, and that will bubble up to the surface. That's the big story of the Black Lives Matter movement. It is hugely successful in part because Black Lives Matter itself is a hugely successful social media campaign. And the third thing is, do not separate yourself from your institutional memory. Civil rights organizations have always been attacked exactly the way they're being attacked now. Civil rights organizations were always seen as subversive. They were always seen as communistic. They were always seen as anti-American. If anybody thinks Martin Luther King Jr. was popular, you have not read a history book that is accurate. Martin Luther King made the 10 most influential people, I think, twice in his life. But the last year, in 1967, that he even got on the list, he was below George Wallace, okay? He was in 7th place. I think George Wallace was 4th. He had 40% something approval ratings at the time that he died. He was followed around by the government. There's never going to be a popular civil rights leader. If you're popular as a civil rights leader, something just ain't right. Like Keith Sweat used to say. So don't be discouraged when civil rights organizations are attacked, and don't run away from your civil rights institutions. You can't do anything alone. Okay, when I was at the home of Walter Scott, who was there ministering to him and counseling him and giving him advice? You need to take advice. Ken Sunshine is on this panel because getting advice from people who know what they're doing really helps when you're in a crisis. It was the NAACP, it was National Action Network. It's these institutions that have helped African American communities for a century. Don't turn away from those institutions. Support them, because you know what? When something happens, and I've said this to Red before, who are you going to call? If something happens to your family, who are you going to call? You need your civil rights institutions. You need your national action networks, because that is who can get on your side and help maximize your voice. You by yourself may not feel powerful, but you have a community. Just use it. Thank you.
Thank you. And if you're interested in being a member, if you're not a member, there is a membership table out front, so you can join today, $25 a year for annual membership. We want to give our panel a great round of applause. They were fantastic. And I'm going to ask that everyone stays in this room. We're actually going to have our AIDS Health Foundation panel in this room. AIDS is a civil rights issue. It's an issue that NAN has been working on. We've been partnering around this issue of HIV and AIDS awareness. So we're going to ask everyone to stay right here, followed by the education panel. And Secretary Duncan, Arnie Duncan from the U.S. Department of Education will be in this room. So we want you to stay right here in your seats. If you need to meet with any of these panelists, we're going to ask you to take a step outside so we can make the quick transition. And panelists, actually, we're not going to have we're going to have the HIV/AIDS panel right here, right now. I'm going to bring Samantha Granberry up.
Great, everyone looks good. Right here for the count 3, 1, 2, 3. And one more for me, 1, 2, 3.